The situation in Pokrovsk continues in favor of the Russians as they manage to capture the settlement of Vilna southwest of Kupiansk, the recapture of some fortified positions in the outskirts of the settlement, and continuous advances within the southern and western parts of the city. The Ukrainians in turn managed to recapture some positions in the residential area, improving their own situation in the area. The Russians are currently flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the western outskirts of the city as the Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the railway area for an additional supply line into the city. The fighting in the northern flank of Pokrovsk is decisive for the battle itself, as a Russian capture of the northern flank will allow them to cut off the main highway in the northern direction and infiltrate the positions of the Ukrainians deeper into their supply lines to cut off and operationally encircle the city of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. But Russians have yet to enter into Mirnorod itself, but are fighting within Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have had several counterattacks launched here in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. However, the Russians have stabilized the situation and are working on reversing it. However, the battle here has in no way been decided as of now. On the wider section of the front line, the Ukrainians have launched a new counterattack in the southwestern outskirts in the vicinity of the Dnipropetrovsk region and Donetsk region border, while the Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the second line of defense in the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians continue offensive operations in the southern and northern flanks of Pokrovsk, with additional advances in the southern flank of Siversk, the full capture and control over Fedorivka, and continuous advances within Kupiansk in the northern section of the front line. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to gain control over some positions here to the southwest of Sosnivka along the forest lines, following the capture of the fortified areas along the second line of defense. The Russians are advancing mainly along the road here to the north of these fortifications to advance in the vicinity of Orestopil. This is to cut off the Ukrainian positions west of Sosnivka and to reach the settlement here south of the Vovcha river line. The other road that leads to Orestopil here is from the eastern flank, from the southern flank of Novoselivka, where the Russians would be within close proximity to Ukrainian positions within the forest patch area here to the northwest of Novoselivka and Velikomukhayelivka. The Ukrainian counterattack managed to re-enter Sosnivka, gain a foothold within the settlement, while fighting continues within it. The Ukrainians also managed to re-enter Novoselivka from the south and from the northern flanks, where the Ukrainians launched a operation to cross over the Vovcha river line, allowing them to regain control over some fortifications and forest lines here in the southern bank of the river line and re-enter Novoselivka from the north. The Ukrainians' objective here is to regain control over the settlements on the northern bank of the river line, here the settlement of Novoselivka and Shishneve, and then push down towards Melievka and towards Oleksandrorad. At the same time, they are pushing in the direction of Horoshe, Sosnivka, and Vorone on the northern flank of these fortifications to reverse the situation of what the Russians are doing. The Russian offensive operations that we have seen over the past months have been to attack the fortified lines from the flank and from the side. This is to attack them at their weakest points. The Ukrainians are here looking to reverse the situation by regaining control of the northern flank of these fortifications. They can push back and reverse the situation in their own favor as long as they have the necessary manpower and equipment to launch such operations and overcome the Russian offensive operations. So they're trying to reverse the situation while the Russians continue their own offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense. In the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the western supply route into the city, while the Ukrainians have managed to regain control over parts of the residential area, which is looking to take the Russian forces out of the residential area in the western parts and regain control over the TO406 highway, which leads into the western flank of Pokrovsk, while the Russian objective is to bypass the fortifications advancing on the western and eastern flank of it to gain control over the flanks of the Ukrainian counterattack and to reach the railway line, where there are forest patches on both flanks of the railway, which provides cover from direct vision of forces on leveled ground, and the forest patches themselves provide cover from FPV drones, both of which would allow Russians to have a much more stable supply line, and the TO406 highway will also be somewhat clear, However, this requires the capture of several fortified lines. There are positions here to the east of Kotlene and on the northern flank of the railway as well. And the additional along the forest lines, there are additional fortifications that the Russians need to capture to secure the TO406 highway, following which they can advance further northwards to gain control of the remaining parts. Advancing along the highway here to strengthen the positions on the western parts of Pokrovsk has the objective to reach the industrial area and gain control over it, which will cut off the E50 highway from entering Pokrovsk from the western direction. Combined with the efforts on the northern flank to cut off the northern highway, will allow the Russians to cut off both of the main highways that lead into Pokrovsk, and it will operationally encircle the city, where the twin city of Milnerad and Pokrovsk share the same fate. The operational encirclement of Pokrovsk would lead to the operational encirclement of Milnerad. On the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to recapture Vilna and the fortifications here on the western flank of Kupiansk Yar, securing the supply line into the settlement, not just through the central parts, but now also from the western flank up to the fortifications. While regaining control over several of the forest lines to the northeast of Vilna, the Russians are securing their positions for flanking maneuvers on the Ukrainian forces. The Russians first managed to gain control over much of Novoshakhove and enter into Doroshne, from which the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to regain control over Novoshakhove, and from the northern flank Doroshne to prevent a Russian capture and solid control over it, to resupply their forces in the direction of Nikhonorivka and down towards Boykivka to cut off the entire grouping of Russian forces in the north. The Russian operation to then regain control over Vilna allows them to outflank the Ukrainian forces and flank the positions in recently captured Novoshakhove with direct assaults towards Novoshakhove as well. They'll be able to recapture Novoshakhove, Ivanivka, and Doroshne to secure the western flank of their positions here in the vicinity of the northern flank of Pokrovsk and in the direction of Dobropilya. Therefore, we will continue to see heavy fighting in this area as the Russians will look to outflank the Ukrainian forces and secure the positions on the northern flank, and the Ukrainians continue to look to encircle the Russian positions in the area from the direction of Volodymyrivka and Doroshne. Moving on to the southern flank of Siversk, the Russians managed to gain full control over Fedorivka. As we see with this shield-kitted footage, the Russians raised their flags on the different parts of the settlement, as well as the road leading up to Fedorivka. All of it is now under Russian control, as the Russians have managed to secure Perishne as well as the settlement here further north. Allowing them to fully secure settlements in the area has allowed them to improve their positions on the southern flank of Siversk. However, the Ukrainians still have significant amount of fortifications on the high ground overlooking the settlement, which makes it difficult for continuous advances from the southern flank of Siversk. The main push will likely be in the direction of Svenivka, where they look to gain control over the residential area, while the fortified positions remain under Ukrainian control. Depending on how well manned these positions are, they can be unsurpassable by the Russian forces without heavily bombarding them with a lot of firepower, which will take a long time. But with continuous advances by the Russians on the flanks, and if they're able to gain control over the fields and forest lines here in between the two railway conjunction here to the south of Siversk, they'll be able to significantly improve their positions in the area, spread out their forces to prevent the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes, and to continue developing offensive operations here on the southern flank of Siversk for the continuous operation on the northern and southern flanks. As for the northern outskirts in the direction of Kupiansk, we see that the Russians continued offensive operations along the apartment complex area in the northern parts and have secured their positions all the way to the industrial area, where we see a very clear indication that the Russians are working on the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the central and northern parts of Kupiansk to gain full control over the settlement and cut off the main highway across the river line with additional crossings along the river line itself. There's the railway crossing, which has been destroyed, and even the satellite imagery and Google Maps confirms this, while the northern isn't updated to show the destruction of this bridge. What we're seeing is that the Russians are constantly bombarding the bridges across the river line to cut off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces across it. A Russian capture of the bridges and the crossings here along the Usk river line will allow them to flank the Ukrainian forces, but also to limit the physical areas in which they can create new crossings, whether it's pontoon crossings or other crossings. This means that the more the Russians control over the Oskar River line, the fewer crossings Ukrainians will have available, and the better fire control the Russians would have over these Ukrainian crossings, whether temporary or permanently built. So what we're seeing is that the Russians' counteroffensive operations gain control over Kupiansk, which will not just act as a logistical hub, but cancelled its effects as a logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces here on the eastern bank of the Oskar River line, and with continuous efforts to cut off the remaining crossings centered around the Osinova direction and Kupiansk itself, as well as any other points through the Oskar River line where the Ukrainians can create new crossings. All of this is looking to be cut off. As we see, the Kupiansk direction has a direct highway to Sinkove from Kupiansk, which is the other point from which the semi-encirclement of Ukrainian forces here on the eastern bank of the Oskar River line is located. This means that the Russians will be looking to reach Sinkove and then cut off, physically encircling all of the Ukrainian forces east of the Oskar River line. We have already seen attempts by the Russians to cross into Sinkove and establish a foothold. This could indicate that the Russians will look to gain control over Sinkove and do a combined push from the northern and southern flanks. In conclusion, what we're seeing is that the Russians, as they are getting closer and closer to physically encircling the Ukrainian grouping of forces east of the Oskar River line, they are slowly capturing position after position with Ukrainian fortifications in the area. It leaves the Ukrainians in a position where they either have completely reversed the Russian capture of Kupiansk to prevent the loss of the city, or for them to completely withdraw their forces from the eastern bank of the Oskar River line back across the river line. In either case, they will likely lose everything east of the Oskar River line in the Kupiansk vicinity, this grouping of forces here. The land itself will be lost if they lose Kupiansk, but whether or not the forces are able to withdraw is a different question. But that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.